Most people walk through a room and see a room. Four walls, a floor, some furniture. Maybe they notice if a lamp is knocked over or a window is broken. Maybe. But the small things, a drawer left open a quarter inch more than the others, a rug bunched at one corner where it was flat last Tuesday, a coffee mug turned so its handle faces the door instead of the wall. Those things pass through the average human eye like light through glass. No friction, no registration, just gone. I was never that kind of person. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the skill or the affliction, depending on who you ask. I notice things, not because I try, because I can't stop. My ex-wife once rearranged the spice rack while I was at work, swapping the cumin and the coriander. And when I came home, I stood in the kitchen doorway for 6 seconds before I even set down my keys. She thought it was a party trick at first. By year 3 of our marriage, she called it something else. Exhausting, I think, was the word she preferred, among others. For 8 years, I put this particular talent to work as an insurance fraud investigator in Phoenix. It paid well. You'd be amazed how many people file a claim for a burglary and forget to mess up the deadbolt, or report water damage in a room where the ceiling shows no staining. I was good at it. I cleared more cases than anyone in my division 2 years running. But the work does something to you. After nearly a decade of looking at the world and seeing only lies, everything starts to feel like evidence. Every crooked picture frame, every out-of-place receipt. Your brain builds a case against reality itself, and eventually, the verdict is always the same. Something here is wrong. Something here has been touched by hands that shouldn't have touched it. I burned out the way most people in that line of work burn out quietly, and then all at once. Signed the divorce papers on a Wednesday. Packed what fit in my truck on a Thursday. Drove north to Flagstaff on a Friday because someone had told me once that the altitude changes the way you think. And I was desperate enough to believe that geography could fix what was broken in my head. It couldn't, of course, but the job I found there came close. Harlan and Keys Land Services operated out of a single-story office on the south end of town, sandwiched between a feed store and a place that repaired saddles. The sign out front was sun-faded to the point of illegibility, which I later learned was intentional. Dale Harlan didn't believe in advertising. He believed in referrals, handshakes, and the quiet competence of doing a thing well enough that people came to you. The company managed remote properties across northern Arizona and the border counties of New Mexico. Ranches, mostly. Homesteads. Parcels of land with structures on them that someone owned but no one lived in. Inheritance properties. Tax shelters. Places where the nearest neighbor was 40 minutes of dirt road away, and the nearest cell tower might as well have been on the moon. Dale's outfit handled the maintenance contracts, the liability inspections, the seasonal checks. And then there was my job. Discrepancy analyst. Dale came up with the title himself. I think he was proud of it. The work was simple to explain and almost impossible to do well. I would drive out to a property, walk every room of every structure, walk the full perimeter, and document anything that had changed since the last visit. Not just damage, not just intrusion, anything. A fence post leaning 2 degrees further than before. A bird's nest on a windowsill that wasn't there last month. Tire tracks on an access road that should have been empty. Dust patterns. Animal activity. The position of objects that no one should have been moving because no one should have been there. I filed my findings in a standardized report: photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates, timestamps. Dale reviewed them, flagged anything that needed action, and passed the rest along to the property owners or their attorneys. Most of the time, the discrepancies were nothing. Wind, weather, animals. Gravity doing what gravity does to neglected things. But sometimes they were something. Squatters, vandals, copper thieves who'd strip the wiring out of a house in a single night and be 3 counties away by morning. The job suited me the way a glove suits a hand. I drove alone through landscapes that didn't care about me. I walked through empty rooms and read their silence like a language only I could hear. For the first time in years, my compulsion had a purpose that didn't involve ruining someone's day. I was good at it. I was happy, or whatever passes for happy when you're a man who inventories dust for a living. I'd been with the company for 7 months when Dale called me into his office and closed the door, which he'd never done before. Dale Harlan was not a door-closing man. He was a lean-in and holler-across-the-room man. So when the latch clicked, I paid attention. He set a folder on the desk between us, thick, dog-eared, coffee-stained on one corner. Maddox Ranch, he said. 4,700 acres, give or take. Main house, barn, equipment shed, livestock pen. Northeast of Chinle, about 20 miles off the 191 Navajo Nation land on 3 sides. He paused, looked at the folder like it owed him money. It's been in rotation for 2 years. We've had 3 analysts on it. I waited for the rest. First one, Garcia, did 4 months and then asked to be reassigned. Said the drive was too long. Wouldn't say more than that. Second one was a woman named Terry Lusk. She did 6 visits, then she quit. Not just that assignment, the company. Walked in one Monday morning, set her badge on the front desk, and walked out. I called her twice. She never picked up. He tapped the folder. Third one was Brennick. He filed 3 reports, each one thinner than the last. Then he stopped filing altogether. Stopped answering his phone. I drove out to his apartment after 2 weeks and his neighbor said he'd moved. No forwarding address. Dale looked at me, not with concern exactly, more like appraisal. I'm not going to dress this up, he said. The property has a high turnover rate. Some people aren't built for remote work. The isolation gets to them. That's the most likely explanation, and it's the one I prefer. Another pause, longer this time. But I need someone on this property, and you're the best I've got. I took the folder home that night and spread its contents across my kitchen table. 3 analysts' worth of reports, organized chronologically. Garcia's were thorough and professional detailed photographs, precise measurements, clean prose. His first 4 reports read like textbook examples of the craft. Then, around report 5, the detail began to thin. Fewer photographs, shorter descriptions. His final report was 2 pages when his average had been 9. No anomalies noted, just the phrase, "Property appears undisturbed," repeated in slight variations for each structure. Terry Lusk's reports were different. She was meticulous, more meticulous than Garcia, possibly more meticulous than me. She photographed everything, measured shadows, noted the direction of wind-blown debris. Her reports were almost obsessive in their precision, and at first I admired that. But starting with her 4th visit, she began noting discrepancies that I couldn't make sense of. Objects that had moved between visits with no logical cause. Animal tracks she described as behaviorally inconsistent. A sound she heard on her 5th visit that she transcribed phonetically but couldn't identify. Her 6th and final report was the longest she ever wrote, almost 14 pages, and it ended mid-sentence. The file simply stopped, as if she'd gotten up from her desk and never sat back down. Brannick's reports were sparse from the start. The man clearly didn't want to be there. His notes were perfunctory, his photographs poorly framed. But in his third and final report, buried in the discrepancy log, between a note about a loose fence rail and an observation about rodent droppings, there was a single entry that I read 3 times before setting the folder down. It said, "Coyote tracks around the main house. Wrong number of toes." No further description, no photograph, no measurement, just that. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading it. The apartment was quiet. Flagstaff was quiet. Outside my window, the ponderosa pine stood black against the sky that was just beginning to show stars, and somewhere in the distance, far enough to be the edge of the world, a coyote called out and received no answer. I drove out to the Maddox Ranch the following Tuesday. The route took me east on the 40, then north on the 191, then onto a series of increasingly neglected roads that seemed to be arguing with the concept of maintenance. Asphalt gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to packed dirt. The dirt narrowed until the scrub on either side brushed the doors of my truck, and the rearview mirror showed nothing but a pale thread of dust hanging in the air behind me, marking where I'd been for anyone who cared to follow. Cell service died about 20 minutes before I arrived. Not gradually, it simply vanished, like a conversation ended by someone hanging up. The silence that replaced it was not the absence of sound, it was a presence. The desert has a silence that pushes against your eardrums, that fills the cab of your truck like water filling a glass. I'd been on remote properties before. I'd driven roads worse than this, but something about this particular silence felt attentive, like the land had noticed me coming and was deciding what to do about it. The Maddox Ranch appeared on the horizon like something the desert had tried to swallow and given up on. I pulled through the gate unlocked, as Dale had said it would be, and parked beside the main house, and I sat in my truck for a full minute before cutting the engine. I told myself I was reviewing my checklist. That was a lie. I was listening. The Maddox Ranch main house was a single-story structure built sometime in the early 1970s. The kind of building that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood shelter, but had no particular opinion about beauty. Horizontal cedar siding, bleached by decades of sun to the color of old bone. A shallow pitch roof with asphalt shingles curling at the edges. 2 windows flanking the front door like tired eyes. A concrete step that had cracked down the middle and been repaired with a seam of morat that was itself beginning to crack. The whole thing sat on a slight rise, maybe 4 feet above the surrounding terrain, which gave it the appearance of something trying to keep its head above water. I stepped out of the truck and the heat wrapped around me like a hand. Late October in most of the country means jackets and falling leaves. In the high desert northeast of Chunlei, it means the sun has dialed itself back from murderous to merely insistent, and the air carries a dryness that pulls the moisture from your lips between one breath and the next. The sky was enormous. I don't know how else to describe it. In the city, the sky is something that happens above the buildings. Out here, the sky was the main event, and everything on the ground, the house, the barn, the equipment shed, the skeletal livestock pen, my truck, me was an afterthought. I stood beside my truck and did what I always do on a first visit. I looked. Not at anything specific, at everything. The way the property sat in the landscape, the angles of the structures relative to each other, the condition of the ground between them packed dirt, cracked in places, scattered with the kind of low scrub that survives on spite and condensation. The barn was 60 yards west of the house, a larger structure with a rusted metal roof and a sliding door that hung slightly off its track. The equipment shed was behind the barn, small, windowless, more of a shipping container with pretensions. The livestock pen was south of everything, a rectangle of post and rail fencing, enclosing maybe half an acre of nothing. No animals, no feed troughs, no water, just dry earth and the memory of use. I pulled my clipboard from the truck, along with my camera, a measuring tape, and the standardized report forms that Dale had designed himself. I uncapped my pen, a black Pilot G2, 0.7 millimeters, the only pen I've used since my fraud investigation days, and wrote the date, the time, and the property identifier at the top of the first page. Then I went inside. The front door was locked, as expected. I used the key from the property file. The lock turned with a dry click that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. Inside, the air was different, cooler, staler, carrying the faint mineral smell of a house that has been breathing its own dust for months. I stood in the entryway and let my eyes adjust. A short hallway led to the main living area. To the left, a bedroom. To the right, a bathroom. Ahead, the hallway opened into a combined kitchen and living room that took up most of the house's footprint. I started with the bedroom, bare mattress on a metal frame, no sheets, a dresser with 3 drawers, all closed. A closet, door ajar, empty except for a wire hanger, and a stack of yellowed newspapers on the floor. I checked the window, locked, intact, no signs of forced entry. I photographed the room from 4 angles, noted the position of the furniture, measured the distance from the bed to the wall because I measure everything and because you never know which measurement will matter later. The bathroom was unremarkable. Toilet, sink, a shower stall with a plastic curtain pulled to one side. A ring of calcium deposits in the toilet bowl. A bar of soap on the edge of the sink, cracked and dry. The brand name still legible. I photographed it. I moved on. The kitchen and living area was the largest room, and this is where I found the first discrepancy. There was a wooden table in the kitchen, rectangular, scuffed, and sun-faded, with 4 chairs around it. I'd reviewed Brannick's photographs before the visit. His photos were poorly composed, but serviceable, and in his images, all 4 chairs were pushed in, evenly spaced, their backs flush with the table's edge. What I was looking at now was nearly identical. 3 of the 4 chairs were exactly as they had been, but the 4th, the one on the side of the table facing the window, was different. It was pulled out, not far, maybe 4 inches, and it was turned, rotated perhaps 10 degrees to the right, so that anyone sitting in it would have been facing not the table, but the kitchen window. The window that looked out over the front yard. The window that looked out toward the gate, toward the road, toward wherever I had driven in from. I stood there and considered it. A house shifts, heat expands wood, cold contracts it. A chair on an uneven floor can migrate over time, nudged by the micro-tremors of a settling foundation. I knew this. I'd explained away 100 similar findings and 100 similar properties. But chairs don't rotate. I photographed it from 3 angles, noted the estimated displacement in inches and degrees, and moved on. That's the discipline. You document. You don't interpret. Interpretation is for the office, for the review, for the people who pay you to notice and then decide what your noticing means. In the field, you are a camera with legs. You record. The second discrepancy was in the hallway. The hall floor was bare wood, and like every horizontal surface in the house, it wore a fine, even layer of dust, the kind that accumulates in an unoccupied structure over weeks and months, undisturbed by foot traffic or air circulation. Uniform, consistent, except along the left wall, where a narrow strip of the floor was clean. Not spotless, but noticeably less dusty than the rest, as if something had passed along it, brushing the wall as it went. The strip was maybe 3 inches wide and ran the full length of the hallway, from the entryway to the kitchen threshold. I crouched down and examined it. Too narrow for a person walking close to the wall. Too high off the baseboard for a mouse or a rat. The clean strip started about 3 inches above the floor and extended upward to roughly 10 inches, as though whatever had brushed the wall was cylindrical or tall, or pressed against the surface at an angle that didn't correspond to any animal I could think of. There were no scratch marks, no hair, no residue, just an absence where the dust should have been. I photographed it, measured the width, the height range, the length. Wrote the details in a hand that was steady because it had no reason not to be, not yet. Outside, I walked the perimeter of each structure. The barn was locked with a padlock that showed no signs of tampering. I peered through a gap in the siding and saw shapes in the darkness: workbenches, shelving, the silhouettes of tools hanging on a far wall. I'd inspect it properly on a subsequent visit once I obtained the key. The equipment shed was padlocked as well. I noted this and moved on. The livestock pen is where I found the third discrepancy. The ground around the pen was harder than the soil near the house. More calcium in the substrate, I assumed, from years of animal waste compacting into the earth. But it was still soft enough to hold prints, especially after the light rain that the weather records told me had fallen 4 days prior. And there were prints. Coyote tracks, mostly. The characteristic 4-toed oval pads scattered around the exterior of the fence, in the aimless patterns of an animal investigating a perimeter. I'd seen thousands of coyote prints in my months on the job. These were unremarkable, except for one set. Near the southeast corner of the pen, a line of coyote tracks approached the fence from the open desert. Normal tracks, normal gait. The front prints slightly ahead of the rear prints. The stride length consistent with a mid-sized coyote, moving at a walk. But over a span of roughly 8 feet, the tracks changed. The stride lengthened. The impressions deepened, as though the animal had gained significant weight between one step and the next. And the shape of the prints themselves shifted not dramatically, not in a way you'd catch at a glance, but in a way that my measuring tape confirmed. The rear prints were wider than the front prints by nearly a full inch. The toe spacing had increased. The gait had gone from quadruped to something I couldn't classify. The last 3 prints before the fence were pressed so deep into the hardpan that I could see the texture of the pad in the dried mud, and they were spaced in a pattern that didn't match any animal locomotion I'd ever studied. The tracks reached the fence and stopped. On the other side of the fence, nothing. Inside the pen, nothing. No prints leading away to the left or right. The animal had walked up to the livestock pen, changed as it walked, and then ceased to exist. I stared at the tracks for a long time. I photographed them from above, from the side, at an angle. I measured stride length, print depth, print width. I sketched the pattern in my notebook. I looked at the fence for hair, for scratches, for any sign that something had climbed over. There was nothing. I drove home. The report I filed that evening was clean and professional. 3 discrepancies noted, all classified as Category 1. Minor, no action required. I described each one in neutral language, using the same precise, bloodless prose I'd used in hundreds of reports before. A chair displaced by thermal expansion, a dust anomaly consistent with structural settling or air movement through an unidentified gap. Animal tracks exhibiting irregular gait, possibly due to substrate variation or an injured limb. I didn't believe any of it, but I wrote it because writing it in clinical language made it feel containable. Made it feel like something that belonged in a report rather than something that belonged in the part of your brain that still remembers what the dark felt like when you were 5 years old. It was late when I finished. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table and began reviewing the photographs on my laptop. Because that's what I do. I compare. I look for what I missed. I click through them methodically. The bedroom, the bathroom, the hallway dust, the kitchen, the exterior, the barn, the pen, the tracks. Each image confirmed what I'd seen in person. Nothing new, nothing I'd overlooked. Then I went back to the kitchen photograph, the one showing the displaced chair. I'd framed the shot to include the window behind it, the window the chair was angled toward, and in the photo, the window was a dark rectangle reflecting the dim interior of the kitchen. My own silhouette was visible, a vague shape holding a camera. But there was something else in the glass. I zoomed in. The image degraded into pixels, but the shape held. In the yard behind the window's reflection, or rather, in the reflection of the yard through the glass, at a distance I estimated to be somewhere between the house and the gate, there was a vertical form, narrow, dark, roughly the height of a fence post. But there was no fence post in that part of the yard. I'd walked every inch of it. I knew what was there and what wasn't. It could have been a shadow, a compression artifact, a trick of the glass and the light and the angle of the late afternoon sun. But it looked like it was standing on two legs. I closed the laptop. I opened it again. I looked at the shape one more time, and then I closed the laptop for the night. And I did not look at it again until morning, when the sunlight through my apartment window made everything from the day before feel like something that had happened to someone else. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, because I was already planning my second visit. 2 weeks is a long time when you're waiting for something you can't name. I kept busy. I had other properties on my rotation. A cattle ranch outside Winslow with a persistent fence issue. A vacation cabin near Show Low that someone's grandchildren were slowly looting of its copper fixtures. A foreclosed mobile home south of Holbrook where the only discrepancy was the relentless and apparently unstoppable growth of a mesquite tree through the bathroom floor. Normal work, quiet drives. Empty rooms that were empty in the way empty rooms are supposed to be absent of people, carrying nothing more sinister than dust and the faint residue of lives moved elsewhere. But every night before I turned off the lamp, I opened my laptop and looked at that photograph. The kitchen, the chair, the window, the shape. I adjusted the brightness, the contrast. I zoomed in until the pixels lost all meaning and became just colored squares on a screen. Some nights the shape looked like nothing, a shadow, a smear, an artifact of low light and cheap glass. Other nights it looked like exactly what it had looked like the first time I'd seen it. Something standing in the yard. Something tall and narrow and upright in a place where nothing tall and narrow and upright had any business being. I didn't show it to anyone. There was no one to show it to. And besides, I knew what a rational person would say, because I'd spent 8 years being that irrational person for other people's inexplicable photographs. It's nothing. It's pareidolia. The human brain sees figures in static the way it sees faces in electrical outlets. You're tired. You're alone. You drove a long way into a quiet place and your pattern-matching software fired on empty data. I knew all of that. I believed none of it. I drove back to the Maddox Ranch on a Tuesday, same as before. The sky was overcast for the first time since I'd moved to Arizona. A low, uniform gray that pressed down on the landscape and stole the shadows. Without shadows, the desert looked flat and depthless, like a photograph of itself. I was 3 miles out from the property, on the final stretch of dirt road, where the scrub closes in and the world narrows to a single lane of packed earth, when I saw the coyote. It was lying in the center of the road, not off to the side, not in the brush where a sick or injured animal might crawl to die. In the exact center, its body oriented lengthwise along the road as if it had been placed there with attention to the lane's midline. It was lying on its right side. Its legs were extended, but not stiff arranged, almost in the posture of a sleeping animal. Its mouth was slightly open. Its eyes were intact, unclouded, and they caught the flat gray light with a dull gleam that made them look wet. I stopped the truck and sat there for a moment, engine idling. There were no tire marks suggesting it had been hit, no blood, no visible wounds of any kind, no flies, which struck me as wrong. A dead animal in the desert, even in cooler weather, attracts insects within hours. The coyote's fur was clean, its body unmarked, and the ground beneath it showed no staining. It looked less like something that had died and more like something that had been set down. Carefully, deliberately, the way you'd place a prop on a stage before the audience arrives. I drove around it. I did not get out to examine it. I'm not sure why. I am a man who measures the displacement of kitchen chairs to the nearest quarter inch, who photographs rodent droppings and catalogs the directional patterns of windblown dust. Caution has never been a word that described my approach to a discrepancy. But I drove around the coyote and I did not stop. At the ranch, I parked in the same spot as before and went through the gate and unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway. And within 4 seconds, I understood that the property had changed. The chair was back. The kitchen chair, the one that had been pulled out 4 inches and rotated 10 degrees toward the window, was now flush with the table, pushed in, aligned with the other 3, exactly as it had appeared in Brannick's photographs from months earlier. I stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at it, and something cold settled into the base of my spine and stayed there for the rest of the day. No one had been here. I'd confirmed it with Dale before driving out. No maintenance crews, no inspections, no visits of any kind. The property had been locked and untouched for 14 days, and yet the chair had moved, not further out of place, back into place, as if whatever had moved it the first time had reconsidered, or as if it had only wanted me to see it once. I checked the hallway. The dust was undisturbed. The clean strip along the left wall that I'd documented on my first visit was gone, covered over by a fresh, even layer of dust, as though it had never been there. I crouched and examined the floor closely. The dust layer was uniform, too uniform. In an unoccupied house, dust accumulates unevenly, thicker in corners, thinner near drafts, patterned by the invisible architecture of air currents. This was even, consistent, like someone had taken a handful of fine desert soil and sifted it across the floor with care. I photographed it. I measured the dust depth with a small ruler, approximately 2 millimeters. consistent across the full length of the hallway. I noted it in my report with the phrase, dust distribution, anomalous uniform accumulation, inconsistent with natural deposition patterns, clinical, contained. A sentence designed to hold something terrible at arm's length. Dale had given me the barn key before this visit. I crossed the yard and unlocked the padlock and slid the door open, and the barn exhaled a breath of trapped air that smelled like rust and old hay, and something else underneath something faintly organic that I couldn't place. Animal, maybe. Not decay. More like the smell of a living thing in an enclosed space, except nothing had been living in this barn for 2 years. The barn interior was roughly what I'd glimpsed through the siding gap on my first visit. Workbenches along the walls, metal shelving, a few bales of ancient hay stacked in one corner, slowly composting into the floor. And on the far wall, a large pegboard with tools hanging from hooks. Wrenches, pliers, a hand rake, a hammer, screwdrivers, wire cutters. I'd studied Brannick's photographs of this wall carefully. In his images, the tools were arranged without any discernible system, scattered across the pegboard in the haphazard way that tools accumulate when a working person hangs them wherever there's an empty hook. The hammer next to the wire cutters, a large wrench beside a small screwdriver, random. That was not what I was looking at now. The tools had been rearranged, every one of them. They were sorted by size, smallest to largest, left to right. The screwdrivers on the far left ascending in length, then the pliers, then the wrenches, then the hand rake, the hammer, the wire cutters. A perfect gradient, deliberate. Organized with a precision that was almost mathematical. The spacing between each tool was identical, as if someone had measured. I stood in front of that pegboard for a long time. I want to be precise about what I felt, because it matters. I was not afraid, not yet. What I felt was something closer to recognition. The same feeling I used to get during a fraud investigation when I'd walk into a staged crime scene and realize that the person who'd set it up had made one critical error, not a mistake of omission, but a mistake of excess. They'd tried too hard. They'd made the scene too perfect, too clean, too organized, and the organization itself became the tell. A real burglary is chaos. A staged burglary is a story someone is telling you. These tools were a story. Something had arranged them, and the arrangement itself was the message. I just didn't know what it was saying yet. I went around behind the equipment shed. The circle was there, on the ground, in a patch of bare earth sheltered from the wind by the shed wall. 5 objects, evenly spaced, forming a rough ring about 2 feet in diameter. I crouched beside it and cataloged each one. A smooth, round stone the size of a golf ball. A rusted bolt, 3 inches long. A piece of bone sun-bleached, probably from a small mammal, a rib or a leg bone. A dead bird, a sparrow or a finch. I'm not an ornithologist lying on its side with its wings folded neatly against its body. Intact. No visible decomposition, despite what must have been days of exposure to heat and scavengers. And a bottle cap, corroded green with age, pressed into the dirt, so that its edges were flush with the surface. 5 objects, 5 points of a circle. Each one placed with care, with intention, with the kind of deliberate spacing that requires measurement or an intuitive understanding of geometry. The gaps between them were not perfect, they varied by perhaps an inch, but they were close. Close enough to be purposeful. Close enough to suggest that whatever had done this was learning.
That's the word that surfaced in my mind as I crouched there in the shadow of the equipment shed. And it's the word that frightened me more than anything else I'd encountered on that property. Not arranging, not placing, learning. Something was practicing the concept of order, teaching itself what it means to put things in their place. I stood up and looked around. The desert stretched out in every direction, flat and gray and featureless under the overcast sky. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The wind was perfectly still. Then I heard the coyote. It came from somewhere north of the property, past the livestock pen, past the fence line, somewhere in the open scrub. A series of short, sharp yips, the kind coyotes make at dusk when they're calling to each other across the cooling desert. Except it was early afternoon.
And except the sound was wrong. I've heard coyotes hundreds of times. Their calls are ragged, organic, imperfect, rising and falling in pitch, varying in duration, carrying the particular roughness of a living throat pushing air through vocal cords that were not designed for music.
What I was hearing now had none of that texture. Each yip was identical to the one before it. Same pitch, same duration, same volume, same spacing. Like a single recording played on a loop, or like something that had heard a coyote once and was reproducing the sound from memory, hitting the right note, but missing everything that made it real. Yip, 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 mechanical, patient, perfectly timed. I walked to the front door of the house and opened it, and the sound stopped. Not faded, not trailed off. It stopped between one yip and the next, the way a recording stops when you press pause. One moment the sound existed, the next moment the desert was silent, with that immense, pressing silence I'd felt on my first visit. The silence that listens. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, waiting. Nothing. The air was still. The landscape was empty. Whatever had been making that sound had either stopped because it was done or stopped because it knew I was listening. I'm not sure which possibility is worse. I walked the northern perimeter, near the fence line, the same stretch where the coyote tracks had ended at the livestock pen. On my first visit, I found new tracks. Coyote prints approaching from the north, moving in a straight line toward the property. Normal tracks for the first 20 feet or so, and then they changed. The transition was smoother this time, gradual, as if whatever was making the tracks had refined the process. Over a span of about 15 feet, the print shifted. The pad shape elongated, the toe marks receded, and the prints became something else entirely. Boot prints. Not the impressions of bare feet shaped like boots. Actual boot prints, treaded soles, a defined heel, the kind of marks left by work boots or hiking boots. Size 11, roughly. But the proportions were wrong. Too narrow through the arch, too long from heel to toe, a size and shape that I've never seen replicated in any catalog or store. The boot prints continued for another 10 feet and then stopped. No scuffing, no turning. No evidence of a person crouching or jumping or being picked up. They simply stopped. The last print as crisp and defined as the first, and beyond it the hard-packed desert floor stretched unbroken to the horizon. I drove out of the property and didn't stop until I had cell signal. Then I pulled to the shoulder and called Dale. He answered on the fourth ring. I told him what I'd found: the rearranged tools, the circle of objects, the sound, the tracks. I kept my voice level. I used the language of reports. I gave him measurements and timestamps and GPS coordinates. Dale was quiet for a long time after I finished. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the creak of his office chair. File what you see, he said finally. That's the job. Dale, the tools were sorted by size. I heard you. Someone is on that property. Another silence. Then, file what you see. I'll review it. I asked him about the previous auditors, about Garcia, who'd asked for reassignment, about Terry Lusk, who'd quit mid-sentence, about Brannick, who'd vanished. The property has quirks, Dale said. His voice was flat, not evasive, exhausted. The voice of a man who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends.
Old land has quirks. You've been doing this long enough to know that. He hung up. That night, I sat in my apartment and searched for everything I could find about the Maddox Ranch. There wasn't much. Property records showed it had been in the Maddox family since 1974. Purchased by a Gerald and Catherine Maddox, who'd run cattle on it until Gerald's death in 2011. Catherine had maintained the property alone until 2019, when she'd apparently left. Not sold, not transferred, left. The property tax payments continued through an automatic trust arrangement, which was how Harlan and Keyes had ended up managing it. The trust's attorney had hired them when it became clear that no one in the Maddox family intended to return. I searched for Catherine Maddox. I found an obituary, not hers, but Gerald's, that mentioned they had one daughter, Ellen, who lived in Albuquerque. I searched for Ellen Maddox, a social media profile, private, with no posts since 2020. A phone number listed in a public directory. I wrote it down, looked at it for a while, and then put the paper in a drawer. The ranch bordered Navajo Nation land on 3 sides. I thought about the tracks, the coyote prints becoming boot prints. I thought about the sound, the mechanical yipping, perfectly repeated, instantly silenced. I thought about the tools, sorted by size with inhuman precision. I thought about the circle of objects, a stone, a bolt, a bone, a bird, a bottle cap, arranged by something that was teaching itself what arrangement means. I thought about all of these things, and for the first time since I'd taken this job, I wished I were the kind of person who could walk through a room and see only a room. I almost didn't go back. I want that on record. I want whoever is listening to this to understand that I am not the kind of man who walks toward danger because he's brave or stupid or has something to prove. I've spent my entire adult life walking into empty rooms and noting what's wrong with them. And the reason I've survived this long is that I've never confused curiosity with courage. Curiosity is a leash. Courage is a choice. I know the difference. For 3 days after my second visit, I told myself I was done with the Maddox Ranch. I would call Dale. I would tell him to assign someone else, or better yet, to drop the property entirely. Let the trust's attorney find another management company. Let someone else drive out to that patch of desert and count the ways it was wrong. I was finished. But I didn't call Dale. Instead, I lay in bed each night and stared at the ceiling and thought about the tools arranged by size on the pegboard. The circle of objects in the dirt. The sound that stopped the instant I opened the door. The boot prints that came from nowhere and went to nowhere. I thought about these things the way an addict thinks about the substance, not with desire, exactly, but with a gravitational pull that operates below the level of decision-making. I noticed things. That was what I did. That was what I was. And the Maddox Ranch was the most noticeable place I had ever been. The compulsion was stronger than the fear. It usually is.
I drove out on a Wednesday this time. I told myself it was because Tuesday's schedule was full. That was a lie. I changed the day because some irrational lizard-brain part of me hope that altering my pattern might matter. As if the thing at the Maddox Ranch was expecting me on a Tuesday. As if it kept a calendar. 3 miles out, I looked for the coyote. The road was empty. No body, no stain, no impression in the dirt where it had lain. The desert had absorbed it completely, or something had removed it, and I couldn't decide which explanation I preferred. But in the exact same spot, the same stretch of road, the same center line, the same orientation, there was a jackrabbit. It was lying on its right side, legs extended, mouth slightly open, eyes intact and catching the light with that same wet gleam. No wounds, no blood, no insects, the same pose, the same presentation. A different animal in the same position, like an understudy stepping into a role. I drove around it. My hands were steady on the wheel. My breathing was even. Inside my chest, something was vibrating at a frequency too low to call fear, and too high to call calm. At the property, I parked and sat in the truck for longer than usual. The sky was clear, again deep, empty blue, the kind of blue that looks like it goes on forever, because it does. The house sat on its rise. The barn stood to the west. The equipment shed crouched behind it. The livestock pen drew its rectangle in the dirt to the south. Everything looked exactly as it had on my first visit. Exactly. And that was the first thing that frightened me. I went inside. The chair was in its place. The dust in the hallway was naturally distributed uneven, thicker in the corners, thinner near the bathroom door where a slight draft crept under the frame. The kitchen was undisturbed. The bedroom was unchanged. The bathroom was the same. I went to the barn. The tools on the pegboard were arranged randomly, the same haphazard configuration they'd been in during Brannock's tenure. The hammer next to the wire cutters. The large wrench beside the small screwdriver. As if they'd never been sorted. As if I'd imagined it. I walked behind the equipment shed. The circle was gone. The ground where it had been was bare, smooth, unmarked. No stone, no bolt, no bone, no bird, no bottle cap, nothing. I stood there in the shadow of the shed and felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not yet, but something structural, like a load-bearing wall developing a crack. Every discrepancy from my previous 2 visits had been erased, not just left alone, actively corrected. The chair returned to its position, the dust redistributed naturally. The tools put back in their original disorder. The circle dismantled without a trace. It was as if something had reviewed my reports, my photographs, my measurements, my clinical descriptions, and methodically undone each observation. Put everything back the way it was supposed to be, cleaned up after itself. The property looked normal. It looked undisturbed. It looked like a place where nothing had ever been wrong, which meant that whatever was here was no longer trying to be discovered. It was trying not to be caught. I almost left then. I should have left then. But I am what I am, and what I am is a man who walks through rooms and notices what's wrong with them. And something was wrong with this property in a way that its sudden normalcy only made worse. An empty room that looks empty is nothing. An empty room that has been made to look empty is a crime scene. So I kept looking. I found the pen cap on the kitchen table. It was sitting in the exact center of the table's surface, not approximately centered, not casually placed, but centered, equidistant from all 4 edges with a precision I confirmed by measuring. A black Pilot G2 pen cap, 0.7 millimeters. The same brand and model,
I've carried every day for the past decade. I reached into my jacket pocket. My pen was there. I pulled it out and looked at it. The cap was missing. It had been missing since my first visit. I'd assumed it had fallen off in the truck, or in the dust of the yard, or somewhere on the long drive home. I hadn't thought about it. People lose pen caps. It's one of the small, meaningless erosions of daily life that doesn't warrant attention. But here it was, on the table, in the center, waiting for me. Something had found it, something had kept it, and something had placed it here, in the one location where I would be certain to see it, positioned with a precision that echoed my own methods, my own obsessive need to measure, to center, to place things exactly where they belong. I picked it up. It was warm. Not from the sun, the kitchen had no direct sunlight at this hour. Warm the way something is warm when it's been held. I put it in my pocket. I don't know why. Evidence, maybe. Proof. Or maybe just the need to take it back, to reclaim something of mine from whatever had taken it. The barn was next. I'd already checked the tools back to their random arrangement, unremarkable, nothing to report. But I looked again, closer this time, because the property had taught me that the obvious discrepancies were distractions and the real ones hid in the margins. The hand rake, third from the left on the pegboard. Its wooden handle was wrapped with something, not tightly loosely, in a single spiral from the base of the handle to the head. Hair, long dark hair, fine as silk thread, wound around the wood in a deliberate helix. I leaned in. The hair was nearly black, with a faint reddish undertone that caught the light from the barn door. It was too fine for horsehair, too long for any canine I knew of. Too dark and too uniform for human hair, which varies in thickness along its length. This hair was perfectly consistent, the same diameter from root to tip, like monofilament. I removed it carefully using the tweezers from my field kit and sealed it in a plastic evidence bag. A habit from my fraud investigation days. Document everything. Collect what you can. Let the lab sort out what the field can't. I stepped outside and walked the perimeter, following the same route I'd taken on my previous visits. Past the house, past the barn, south toward the livestock pen, then east along the fence line to the northern boundary. I was looking at the ground. I am always looking at the ground. The ground is where the truth lives, because the ground can't lie. It can only receive the impressions of what passes over it, and hold them until wind or rain takes them away. My own boot prints from the previous visits were still visible in the hard-packed soil near the barn. Faint but legible, the distinctive tread pattern of my Red Wing work boots. Size 10, the left heel slightly more worn than the right. From a gait asymmetry I've never bothered to correct. I could trace my own path from visit to visit, each set of prints overlaying the last, like geological strata. But now there was a second set, beside my prints, exactly beside them. Step for step, stride for stride, a parallel line of boot prints that ran alongside mine, from the barn to the livestock pen. The same tread pattern, the same size, the same slight asymmetry in the left heel. Identical in every measurable way to my own prints, as if I had walked this path twice, side by side with myself. Except the second set was deeper. I crouched down and measured. My prints depressed the soil by approximately a quarter inch, consistent with my weight, about 180, distributed through the soles of my boots. The parallel prints were sunk nearly half an inch into the same substrate.
Same foot size, same tread, twice the depth. Whatever had made these prints weighed significantly more than I did while having exactly the same feet. I stared at those prints for a long time. The sun was beginning to angle toward the western horizon, stretching the shadows of the fence posts into long, thin fingers that reached across the ground toward me. The silence was enormous, and then the silence ended. The sound came from the north, from the direction of the fence line, from the scrub beyond the property boundary, from the same area where I'd heard the mechanical coyote calls on my last visit. But it wasn't a coyote this time. It was a voice, a human voice, or something so close to a human voice that the difference only registered in the deeper, older parts of my brain, the parts that evolved before language, before logic, before the comforting fiction that the world is knowable and safe. The voice was speaking a single word, my name, my first name, over and over and over. Same pitch, same cadence, same flat, effectless delivery. No emotion, no inflection, no rise at the end to suggest a question, no fall to suggest a statement. Just the word, repeated with the same mechanical precision as the coyote yips had been identical iterations, identically spaced, produced by something that had learned the shape of the sound but not its meaning. It was coming from roughly 60 yards out, past the fence line. Somewhere in the low brush, I couldn't see anything. The scrub was waist high and thick, and the late afternoon light was turning everything to gold and shadow. I did not walk towards the voice. I want to be clear about this. Every investigative instinct I have, every compulsion that has defined my professional life, every fiber of the pattern-seeking, anomaly-hunting machine that lives inside my skull was screaming at me to walk towards that sound, to close the distance, to see. I did not. I turned around and walked to my truck, not running. Running felt like it would be wrong, not morally wrong, but strategically wrong, like running from a dog. I walked at a steady pace, my boots crunching on the gravel, my keys already in my hand. I opened the door, I got in, I started the engine. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the gate. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, standing at the property gate. The gate I had driven through 2 minutes ago, the gate that was still closed, still latched, undisturbed. A figure, tall, motionless, shaped like a person the way a scarecrow is shaped like a person. The general idea was there, but the execution was wrong. It was too tall. Not by a dramatic amount, not 8 feet. Not monstrously oversized, but by enough. Maybe 6'6", 6'7". Its proportions were off in ways that my eye registered faster than my brain could catalog. The arms were too long relative to the torso, hanging past where the hips should have been. The shoulders were too narrow. The head was tilted to the right at an angle of maybe 25 degrees, the kind of tilt you'd see in a person glancing quizzically at something. Except no human neck holds that angle comfortably. And this figure was holding it with the stillness of a thing that doesn't need to be comfortable, because comfort is a concept it hasn't learned yet. I couldn't see the face. The distance and the angle in the rearview mirror reduced it to a dark oval above the narrow shoulders. But I had the sense, not the evidence, not the observation, just the sense that the face was pointed at me. That whatever features it had were oriented toward my truck. That it was watching me leave the way I had watched the property on my first visit, clinically, attentively, taking notes. I drove. The figure didn't move. It stood at the gate and it did not move, and I watched it in the mirror until the road curved and the dust rose and the Maddox Ranch disappeared behind me like a thing that had never been real. I drove 40 minutes without stopping. When I finally pulled over, it was because my hands had started shaking and I didn't trust them on the wheel anymore. I sat on the shoulder of the 191 with the engine running and the doors locked and the heater on despite the fact that it was 65 degrees outside, and I breathed and I shook and I watched the empty road behind me in the mirror. Nothing followed me, nothing I could see. I didn't sleep well for the next 11 days. I want to be specific about that number because precision is all I have left, and because the alternative is to say, I didn't sleep well for a while, which is the kind of vague, soft-edged language that belongs to people who experience things approximately. I experience things exactly. That's the problem. 11 nights, each one the same. I would lie in bed in my Flagstaff apartment with the lights off and the curtains drawn and my eyes open, and I would listen to the building settle around me, the creak of the floor joists, the tick of the baseboard heater, the muffled sound of my upstairs neighbor walking to the bathroom at 2 in the morning, and every sound would register as a discrepancy. Every sound was something that might not be what it seemed. A footstep that was slightly too heavy, a creak that came from the wrong direction, a silence between sounds that lasted a beat too long. During the days, I worked my other properties and filed my reports and spoke to Dale in the clipped professional shorthand we'd developed over the months. I didn't mention the Maddox Ranch. He didn't ask. We orbited the subject like two people in a hallway trying not to make eye contact. At night, I reviewed the photographs, all of them. Every image I'd taken across 3 visits arranged chronologically on my laptop screen. I went through them slowly, not just the discrepancy photos, not just the images I'd flagged for my reports, but the incidental shots, the establishing photos I take of each room before I begin my assessment, the wide-angle perimeter shots, the background images I barely glance at in the field because they're just context, just wallpaper, just the blank space around the thing I'm actually looking at. I found them in the background, in a photograph from my first visit, an exterior shot of the barn taken from the northeast corner of the house. There was a shape in the shadow beneath the barn's overhang. Not the entity, nothing that clear. Just a density in the shadow that didn't correspond to any structural element I could identify. A darker patch within the dark, roughly vertical, roughly the height of a person standing still. In a photograph from my second visit, the interior of the equipment shed, shot through the open door, there was something in the far corner, behind the shelving. A shape that could have been a folded tarp or a shadow cast by the shelving unit itself. Except the light source was behind me, which meant the shelving shadow should have fallen forward, toward the door. This shadow fell the wrong way. In another photo from my second visit, the livestock pen, shot from the south, there was a distortion along the top rail of the fence on the far side. A thickening. As if something was crouched behind the rail, gripping it, peering over. Or as if the fence post itself had grown a protuberance that hadn't been there when I'd walked past it 20 minutes earlier. 3 visits, dozens of photographs, and in at least 7 of them, buried in the margins and the backgrounds and the unexamined peripheries, there were shapes. Not clear, not definitive, but present, consistent, positioned, always at the edges of my attention, in the places I wasn't looking, in the frames I wasn't composing, in the spaces between the things I was trained to notice. It had been there every time, from the very first visit, watching me work, standing just outside the radius of my focus while I measured dust and cataloged tracks and photographed chairs. Patient, still, learning. I called Dale on a Thursday morning. I told him I was going back to the Maddox Ranch. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. I'm going to say something, Dale said finally, and then I'm going to leave it alone and let you make your own decision, because you're a grown man and you don't work for me in the way that means I get to tell you what to do. I waited. The last auditor who went out 5 times was Terry Lusk. You read her reports. You know how they ended. He paused. I could hear him choosing his words the way a man chooses his steps in a minefield. She came back. I want to be clear about that. She drove back to Flagstaff and she walked into this office and she was alive and she was whole and she was physically fine. But she was not the same person who had driven out there that morning. Something was different. Something behind her eyes. Like a room that's been emptied out and refurnished by someone who didn't quite remember where everything went. Another pause. She quit the next day. I tried calling her twice. She answered once. She didn't say anything. She just breathed into the phone for about 30 seconds and then hung up. I haven't heard from her since. I told Dale I understood. Do you? He said. I told him I was going anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then, drive out at first light. Don't stay past noon. And if you hear something that sounds like a person, but doesn't feel like a person, you get in your truck and you leave. You don't investigate. You don't document. You leave. I drove out at dawn. The light was pale and directionless, the sun still below the eastern mesa, the sky a gradient of gray and gold that hadn't committed to either. The road was empty, no coyote, no jackrabbit, no arranged corpse marking the 3-mile threshold. Just dust and scrub and the long straight line of packed earth leading toward the property. I should have been relieved. Instead, the absence felt like a held breath. I noticed the shadows first. It was subtle, the kind of thing that 99 people out of 100 would never register. The kind of thing that the 100th person would notice and immediately dismiss as a trick of the early light. The scrub brush along the roadside cast shadows to the west, which was correct for an eastern sunrise. But the shadows were wrong by a few degrees. Not dramatically, maybe 5 degrees off true. Angled slightly north of where they should have been, as if the light source wasn't the sun, but something near the sun. Something close to it, but not exactly it. I checked my compass. I checked the time. I checked the position of the sun, now cresting the mesa in the exact spot it should have been. The shadows didn't match. The world was 5 degrees out of alignment, and the only person who would ever notice was someone whose entire life had been built around noticing. And I was driving toward the only place on earth that knew this about me. The Maddox Ranch appeared. I pulled through the gate. I parked. The front door of the main house was open. In 4 visits across 2 months, the front door had always been closed and locked. I had always used the key. The door had always resisted slightly swollen wood in a dry frame, the small friction of a house holding itself shut. Now it stood open, not ajar, not cracked fully open, swung inward against the hallway wall, as if the house had exhaled and hadn't bothered to close its mouth. I sat in the truck for 3 full minutes. Dale's voice in my head. If you hear something that sounds like a person, but doesn't feel like a person, you get in your truck and you leave. I hadn't heard anything yet. The morning was silent. The house was still. I went inside. The furniture had been rearranged, not damaged, not overturned, not scattered in the chaos of a break-in or the aftermath of a struggle. Rearranged. Every piece of furniture in the main living area, the kitchen table, the 4 chairs, the couch against the far wall, a small bookshelf, an end table had been moved to face the front door. Turned, oriented, angled inward toward the entryway, so that the room now resembled nothing so much as an audience.
Rows of furniture arranged like seats in a theater, all of them pointed at the spot where I was standing, as if the house had been prepared for my arrival, as if something had set up the room the way you'd set up a room for a guest you'd been expecting. I stood in the doorway and I looked at the room, and the room looked back at me through the blind faces of its furniture, and I felt something I had never felt before in my career. Not during fraud investigations, not during midnight property checks, not during any of the hundreds of times I'd walked into a space that wasn't mine and read its secrets. I felt seen, not watched, not observed, seen. The way you see a person, the way you look at someone and understand that they are a specific individual with a specific shape and a specific way of moving through the world. The room knew who I was. The room had been arranged for me. No one else. Me. On the kitchen table, now pushed to the center of the room and facing the door like a desk, there were 3 objects arranged in a row. The pen cap. Again. I'd taken it home with me. I put it in a drawer in my kitchen. I checked my pocket reflexively, knowing it wouldn't be there, knowing it would be here, because of course it would be here. This place took what it wanted and returned what it chose. A button. Small, dark brown, plastic. I recognized it before I reached for it. It was from my field jacket, a canvas coat I wore on every visit. I looked down. The second button from the bottom was missing. The thread was still there, frayed, as if the button had been pulled free with a slow, patient pressure. And a photograph. I picked it up. It was my employee ID photograph. The headshot taken during my first week at Harlan and Keyes. A flat, expressionless image of my face against a white background. The same photo laminated onto the badge clipped to my jacket. I unclipped my badge and held it beside the photograph. Identical. The same image, reproduced at the same size, with the same colors and the same flat lighting. But the photograph wasn't printed. The paper, if it was paper, had a texture I'd never encountered. Slightly rough, like canvas, but organic. Fibrous. When I turned it over, the back was smooth and faintly warm. Warmer than the ambient temperature of the room. Warmer than an object sitting on a table in an unheated house should have been. It felt less like something that had been manufactured and more like something that had been grown, cultivated, produced by a process that understood the concept of a photograph but not the technology. I put the photograph in my evidence bag. I put the pen cap and the button in my pocket. I left the house. Outside, the livestock pen had changed. From ground level, the difference was difficult to parse. The fence posts looked displaced, unevenly spaced, as if someone had pulled them from the ground and replanted them in different positions. But the pattern wasn't random. There was a structure to it that I couldn't read from where I was standing. The way a word written in letters 20 feet tall is illegible to someone standing at its base. I went to the barn. I climbed the wooden ladder bolted to the interior wall, a maintenance access to the hayloft, and stepped out onto the roof through a hatch that groaned under my weight. From the top of the barn, 18 feet above the ground, I looked south toward the livestock pen. The fence posts had been rearranged into the shape of a human figure. Not a stick figure, not a crude approximation. A silhouette, detailed, proportioned. The posts formed the outline of a person standing with their arms slightly away from their body, and their head tilted to the right. The way I tilt my head when I'm examining something at close range, a habit I didn't know I had until I saw it reproduced in fence posts on a dead ranch in the Arizona desert. It was my silhouette, my proportions, my posture. assembled from the bones of a livestock pen by something that had studied me carefully enough to know the angle of my head when I'm working. I climbed down from the barn roof. My hands were shaking again, but my eyes were steady, because my eyes have never failed me even when every other part of me has, and they did not fail me now. I walked north, toward the fence line, toward the place where the tracks always led, where the sounds always came from, where the shape in the photographs always lingered. I don't know why. Dale told me not to investigate. Every rational thought in my head told me to leave. But something pulled me forward, not curiosity anymore, not compulsion, but something older and simpler. The need to see, the need to know, the need to look at the thing that had been looking at me and understand finally what I was dealing with. I saw it from 60 yards away. It was standing in the scrub just beyond the property fence, still, upright, in full daylight, in the clear morning sun, with no shadow to hide in and no distance to blur its edges. I stopped walking. I raised my binoculars. I am going to describe what I saw with the same precision I've applied to every discrepancy I've ever documented. Because precision is the only tool I have, and because what I saw deserves to be recorded accurately, even if accuracy makes it worse. It was tall, taller than it had appeared in the rearview mirror, maybe 6'8", maybe 6'10". Its body was narrow, proportioned like a person stretched vertically on a rack. The torso too long, the limbs extended beyond normal human ratios. The arms hung past the hips, the fingers, and there were fingers. I could see them reaching almost to the knees. The legs were disproportionately long, slightly bent at the knee, in a way that suggested the joint could flex in directions ours can't. The skin was a color I don't have a word for. It wasn't gray. It wasn't brown. It wasn't the color of any living thing I've seen. It was a color that existed between other colors, a tone the eye couldn't settle on. It shifted depending on the angle, like oil on water, except it wasn't iridescent. It was matte, flat. A color that seemed designed to be forgettable, to slide out of perception the moment you looked away. It was wearing something, not clothing. The idea of clothing. There was a texture on its torso and legs that suggested fabric folds, seams, the drape of material over form, but the texture didn't resolve. It was like looking at clothing through frosted glass. The shape was there, but the detail wasn't, as if the concept of dressed had been applied without understanding what clothes actually are. The face. I have to talk about the face. It had features, a nose, a mouth, eyes, the general architecture of a human face arranged on a human-shaped head. But the placement was wrong. The eyes were set too far apart, not grotesquely, not like a fish, but by maybe half an inch on each side, enough that the face looked subtly flattened, subtly wide. The mouth was positioned slightly too high, closer to the nose than it should have been, which left an expansive chin below it that was smooth and featureless and longer than any human chin. The nose was approximate the right general shape, the right general size, but without the small asymmetries and imperfections that make a real nose look real. It was a nose designed by someone who had seen noses but never touched one. It was a first draft of a human face, built from observation, assembled from reference material, close enough to recognize, wrong enough to never forget. It was holding something. I adjusted the binoculars, focused, a clipboard, a pen. Held the way I hold them, clipboard angled at 20 degrees against the forearm, pen gripped between the first and second finger. Weight shifted onto the left leg with the right foot turned slightly outward. My posture, my stance. The exact position I adopt when I'm standing in a yard or a room, surveying a property, cataloging what I see. It was mimicking me. Not as I look now as I had looked on my first visit weeks ago. It had stored the image, filed it, reproduced it with the same attention to detail that I bring to my reports. We stood there, 60 yards apart in the bright morning sun, and the desert was silent around us in a way that felt intentional, as if the landscape itself had paused to watch what happened next. The entity raised its right hand, slowly, not a wave, not a greeting, not a threat, a gesture. It extended one finger long, too long, the first knuckle where the second should have been, and tapped the air. 1. A pause, another tap. 2. A pause, another tap. 3. A pause, another tap. 4. It was counting my visits. It was telling me it knew, every time, from the beginning. It had been there, and it had been counting, and now it was showing me the number like a score, like a tally, like an auditor's mark in a ledger. Then it lowered its hand, and it turned away from me, and it walked toward the mesa. Its gait was wrong. I've said that before about the figure in the mirror, but seeing it up close was different. The wrongness was specific. It moved too smoothly, no bounce, no sway, no micro adjustments of balance that the human body makes with every step. It glided forward as if on rails, its upper body perfectly still while its legs moved beneath it in long, even strides. It looked like a person walking in a film played at 90% speed, almost right, almost natural, but running on a different clock than the rest of the world. It reached the fence. The fence was 4 feet high, post and rail, solid enough to require a climb or a detour. The entity did neither. It stepped over the fence without breaking stride. Its lead leg extended upward and over the top rail, the knee bending backward, and the foot clearing the rail by inches, and then the trailing leg followed in the same impossible articulation. And the entity was on the other side and still walking, still gliding, still moving toward the mesa with the clipboard held against its arm and the pen gripped between its wrong fingers. I watched it until it disappeared into the landscape, not behind anything, not over a ridge or into a canyon. It simply became harder to see, its forgettable skin blending into the desert tones, its outline dissolving into the brush and the rock in the distance until I couldn't be sure I was still looking at it, or at the memory of where it had been. I stood at the fence for a long time after it was gone. The sun was climbing, the shadows were falling in the right direction now, as if the world had corrected itself, as if the 5-degree error I'd noticed on the drive-in had been smoothed over while I wasn't paying attention. I walked back to my truck. I drove through the gate. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not look back at the Maddox Ranch, because I understood now what I was to, the thing that lived there, and the understanding was worse than the fear. It wasn't hunting me, it wasn't threatening me, it wasn't trying to frighten me away, or lure me closer, or consume me, or harm me in any of the ways that monsters in stories harm the people who find them. It was auditing me. It was doing my job. It was walking my perimeter. It was noting my discrepancies, the pen cap I'd dropped, the button that was loose, the photograph on my badge that showed what I looked like when I wasn't looking back. It was cataloging me the way I catalog properties. It was filing its observations with the same clinical precision I brought to my reports. And it was showing me its work, object by object, visit by visit, because that's what a good analyst does. You document, you present your findings, you let the subject see what you've seen.
I drove back to Flagstaff, and I did not stop shaking until I was inside my apartment with the door locked and every light on. And even then, the shaking was only in my hands, and the stillness was only on the surface, and beneath it, something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of my understanding of the world. Like a house discovering that its foundation has been wrong this whole time, not cracked, not broken, just built on ground that was never as solid as it appeared. I quit on a Monday, walked into the Harlan and Keyes office before Dale had finished his first cup of coffee, and set my badge on the desk, the badge with the photograph still laminated to it, the photograph that now had a twin made of something warm and organic sitting in an evidence bag in my apartment.
Dale looked at the badge. He looked at me. He didn't ask why. "I understand," he said. That was it. No exit interview, no 2-week notice. No paperwork beyond a single form that Dale filled out himself while I stood in his office and looked at the sun-faded map of northern Arizona pinned to the wall behind his desk. I could see the Maddox Ranch on that map, a small rectangle of crosshatched lines northeast of Chinle, bordered on 3 sides by the reservation, marked with a red pushpin that was slightly crooked, leaning to the right at an angle of about 25 degrees. I didn't straighten it. I didn't touch it. I left it leaning, and I walked out of the office, and I drove to my apartment, and I packed what fit in my truck, which was almost everything, because I am a man who has spent his life accumulating observations rather than possessions. And I left Flagstaff. I moved east, I won't say where. A small city, mid-Atlantic, the kind of place where the buildings are old enough to have settled into their foundations, and the trees are tall enough to block the sky. I found an apartment on the 3rd floor of a converted row house. I found a job data entry, mindless, the kind of work that requires just enough attention to keep your hands busy and not enough to engage the part of your brain that ruins everything. I went to the grocery store. I cooked meals. I watched television without seeing it. I tried to become the kind of person who walks through a room and sees a room. I couldn't. The thing about noticing is that it's not a skill. A skill can be set aside. You can choose not to play the piano. You can choose not to speak French. You can't choose not to see. And once you've spent a lifetime training your perception to catch the misaligned, the displaced, the subtly wrong, once you've turned your nervous system into an antenna tuned to the frequency of things that don't belong, you can't retune it. You can't turn it off. You just receive. I noticed things in my apartment, small things, the kind of things that a normal person would never register, and that I tried, with increasing desperation, to attribute to the ordinary entropy of daily life. A coffee mug on the kitchen counter rotated 15 degrees from where I'd left it that morning, the handle pointing toward the sink instead of toward the wall. A shoe by the front door turned inward, toe pointing at the opposite shoe, when I always leave them parallel. A book on the nightstand moved from the left side to the right. A towel in the bathroom refolded with the tag facing out. For months I told myself it was nothing. Memory errors. The small rearrangements that occur when a mind is stretched too thin and a body moves through space on autopilot. I told myself that I was projecting, seeing the Maddox Ranch in every shadow, reading intent into the random drift of objects through an occupied space. I told myself that this is what happens when you break. You see patterns where there are none. You read messages in the noise. I almost believed it. Then I found the photograph. It was a Thursday evening in late February, 4 months after I'd left Arizona. I was sitting at my kitchen table, a different kitchen, a different state with my laptop open, going through old files. I don't know what I was looking for. Closure, maybe. Evidence that what I'd experienced had been real, or evidence that it hadn't, or just the familiar comfort of organizing data, arranging files, putting things in their proper place. The ritual of order, the illusion of control. I opened the folder labeled Maddox and scrolled through the photographs. Hundreds of them, arranged by date, each one a small window into the property I tried to leave behind. The house, the barn, the dust, the tracks, the tools, the circle, the figure at the gate. I looked at each one the way you look at photographs of a place where something terrible happened to you, with the strange, detached recognition that you were there, that this was real, that the person in these images is technically you, but also someone you no longer have access to. Near the end of the third visits folder, I found an image I didn't recognize. It was timestamped 14/47/22 on the date of my third visit. It was a photograph of the main house taken from outside the property, from a position north of the fence line. The angle was low, not ground level, but lower than my eye height, as if the camera had been held at waist level, or as if the photographer had been crouching. The composition was rough, slightly off-center, the house filling most of the frame but not all of it. And in the yard, visible between the house and the barn, there was a figure. Me, standing in the hard-packed dirt near the livestock pen, clipboard angled against my forearm, pen in hand, head tilted to the right. Working, cataloging, doing my job. Unaware that I was being photographed from 60 yards away by something standing at the northern fence line. I stared at the image for a long time. I had not taken this photograph. I knew this with the same certainty I knew my own boot size. The same certainty I knew the exact position of every piece of furniture in my apartment. I had been inside the property on my third visit. I had been walking the perimeter, checking the barn, finding the pen cap and the hair and the duplicate boot prints. My camera had been in my hand or in my jacket pocket for the entire visit. No one else had been present. No one else had access to my camera. No one else had hands. Nothing else had hands. But something had taken this photograph. Something had held my camera, or something like my camera. Something that understood the function without possessing the object, and had framed a shot and captured an image and filed it in my camera's memory alongside my own photographs, in sequence, with a timestamp that placed it squarely within the window of my third visit. It had documented me, the same way I documented properties, with a camera, with a frame, with the quiet, clinical intent of someone recording a discrepancy for later review. I closed the laptop. I sat in my kitchen and I listened to the building breathe around me, and I tried to feel something that wasn't dread. I tried to feel anger or resolution, or the righteous clarity of a man who has finally seen the full shape of the thing he's been running from. I felt none of those things. I felt only the slow, cold understanding that I had never stopped being observed. That the distance I'd put between myself and the Maddox Ranch, the miles, the months, the state lines, the new apartment, the new job, the new life was not distance at all. It was slack and a leash I hadn't known I was wearing. I looked up from the laptop. On the windowsill of my third-floor apartment, there was an object that had not been there when I'd come home from work that evening. Small, black, plastic. Sitting on the painted wood of the sill, positioned with a precision I recognized, equidistant from the edges, centered with the kind of care that requires either measurement or an intuitive understanding of geometry that most humans don't possess. A pen cap. Pilot G2.
0.7 millimeters. I stood up. I walked to the window. I looked out at the street below the row houses, the parked cars, the bare winter trees, the streetlight on the corner casting its orange cone on the sidewalk. The street was empty. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But across the road, on the sidewalk beneath the streetlight, there was a shadow. It was tall and thin, and it fell away from the base of the light, at an angle that was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not impossible, but wrong by a few degrees. 5 degrees, maybe. The shadow of something standing beneath the streetlight, standing still, standing in the posture of a person waiting. Except there was nothing there. The sidewalk was empty. The light illuminated bare concrete and the trunk of a leafless elm and nothing else. The shadow didn't move. I stood at the window for a long time. The pen cap was warm in my hand. I picked it up without deciding to. The way you pick up something that belongs to you. The way you reach for a thing that has been returned. Outside, the shadow held its position beneath the streetlight. Patient and still, watching my window the way I had once watched the Maddox Ranch from the cab of my truck, with the quiet, methodical attention of someone cataloging a discrepancy. I didn't close the curtain. There was no point. It had my photograph one it had taken, and one it had grown. It had my pen cap. It had my boot prints and my posture, and the angle of my head and the rhythm of my steps. It knew the layout of my routine the way I knew the layout of an empty property. I was documented, filed, assessed, every detail noted, every discrepancy cataloged. I was a property it had walked through, room by room, and it knew where everything was and where everything should be, and it would always know when something was out of place. I set the pen cap on the windowsill exactly where I'd found it, centered, precise. Then I sat back down at my kitchen table, in my third-floor apartment in a city I won't name, in a life that no longer felt entirely mine. And I waited for the next visit. Because that's how it works. I know that now. You go out, you walk the property, you document what you find. You file your report, and you drive home and you tell yourself that the job is finished, that the assessment is complete, that you've seen everything there is to see. But the property is never finished with you, and some discrepancies don't stay in the report. They follow you home.